Ever wonder what everyone's doing on their phones? They're banking with Bank of America. They're saving, planning, and budgeting all before dessert.
Digital tools so impressive, you just can't stop banking. What would you like the power to do?
Well, welcome. I think you guys, as I've been thinking about this event, I thought, this is the black box of business, is investing, venture capital. So I have the first question that I think is the most important question. Where does the money come from in venture capital?
Well, the venture capital funds themselves go out to fundraise, sort of like what startups do. And the money ultimately comes from big institutional investors like foundations, endowments, pension funds. It comes from corporations. It comes from family offices, increasingly coming from family offices or high net worth individuals. Anybody with large pools of money these days is looking to get the returns that venture capital tends to provide, at least as part of their portfolio.
I'll add that venture capital is often the types of capital that is most talked about in the public, but other risk capital is also what our founders are looking for. So, we have angel investors, angel networks in Michigan, but that's just one of many components that you can think about risk capital that founders are looking for dollars to accelerate their business.
And some of the role of public capital, or in this case, state-backed funds in this case, for an emerging ecosystem like Detroit. Startup corridor between Detroit and Ann Arbor recently ranked the #1 emerging startup corridor globally. But being in that emerging category for part of that, this is where some of the state investments can come in and help close the gap on some of the dollars and cents that most venture capitalists or other risk capital providers may be looking for when they're strictly looking at the bottom line. And so state dollars, as an example, can help make that a little bit more attractive as we're trying to make that flywheel get moving.
I think your Assembly Ventures invests a lot in transportation-related stuff. What are you looking for when you're trying to determine whether something is a good investment, promising, or not?
Yeah, well, and you mentioned backstage you wanted to kind of get into the heart of it. So we do invest in mobility and transportation, and we do that on behalf of our own investors. And so we have investors that come from the automotive industry, families, so on and so forth, and they want to see one of two things. One is a strategic return, understanding about what's happening in the industry. So they look to us to get that context. But for many of them, they look at our fund just as anybody else's, which is an asset class, which is supposed to return at a higher rate of return than pretty much anything else that they invest in. In our fund, we invest globally with a focus in North America and Europe. And one of the things that we've talked a little bit about today, but not really, is the changing geopolitical landscape as it relates to China. And this is important both for the investments that we make, but also back to this question about where the money comes from. So we're investing out of Fund 1. We started raising in 2021. And one of the things that I learned coming from industry is this question of where the money comes from. And I thought maybe we'd call some of the families that we know and we would start to get the round together. What shocked me more than anything is that for many of our universities, our philanthropies, those are managing large endowments. They have more money invested in Chinese managers than they do venture managers here in the Midwest. And there's been a time and a place where that's been valid because they've been chasing the returns to drive the overall return of the endowment. But I would argue as we think about the deals that we want to make, but also the capital that we need in the region, we need to look at that in a new way.
You run into a lot of Chinese people like yourself are they bullish in the space as well?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's no denying that electrification is driving many of the innovations at the corporate level in this industry, but not exclusively. Think about AI, think about robotics more broadly. This is a race between two of the larger players in the world, the US and China. Europe being a very important ally. This has nothing to do with the Chinese people. This is a national policy from the party in China. And so when we think about Michigan's role, I would offer we need to think about how we play on the global stage. That's actually why I wore the Lions shirt today. I want to talk about winning, which is, yes, we need Detroit and Ann Arbor together. Yes, we need to think about our context in the conversation at the national level, but this is a global game we're playing, and so the US has to do better.
What's the smart, Rishi, you might be able to address this. What's the smart money looking for in a project, in the principles behind an idea, in the startup ecosystem? I mean, does where these people live and work that have this idea matter to investors?
Yeah, of course it matters. All the factors that you want to invest into essentially a person matter, right? Because we're talking about nascent companies or just an idea sometimes. And so when you're thinking about where you want to place your money, it really revolves around that person or persons, the founders, the co-founders, that you're putting those dollars to often. And so a number of factors, including where they are, play into that decision. And we have so many founders here in Michigan that themselves have committed to building here, to growing here, to wanting to raise here, and sometimes running into roadblocks that might not allow them to completely fundraise the way they want to and build their companies here.
Founders being the people who have the idea that is scalable and worth
That's
investing
right.
in. I mean, by definition.
Yeah, exactly. And we've, in Detroit especially, and around the region, we've done some good programming in supporting entrepreneurs that didn't exist, 10, 15 years ago. But oftentimes when we're talking about entrepreneurs, we're thinking about Main Street entrepreneurs. And so we've made a lot of progress there, still a lot more work to do to support those entrepreneurs, but we're specifically talking about founders with scalable, disruptive, high growth potential ideas. And that's where we need to spend more of our time building culture and pathways to access that early capital.
For either of you, what are the hottest sectors right now in Michigan and nationally for this kind of venture capital? I mean, if you're in Michigan, is it really focused more towards transportation and, the offshoots of the auto industry, electrification, all that? Or is it more broad-based into life sciences, healthcare, and other things?
I think an illustrative point here is that since Michigan's first startup unicorn, company worth $1 billion or more, in 2018, that was Doug Song's Duo, we've graduated or grown, 8 or more at this point now, unicorns since 2018. I think that's an amazing track record, but I think what's really interesting about it is that if you look at those companies, only one is a mobility company, and it has an asterisk because it came here and then left. That was Rivian. But outside of all the rest, you have cybersecurity, supply chain logistics, life sciences, marketplace. You have this collection of things that I don't think most folks in Michigan would think, yeah, that's our strength. But actually, we're good at a lot of things in addition to some of the mobility ecosystem.
Chris, what are the markers of a fertile kind of ecosystem for this kind of investment? I mean, what do you look for if you're looking in other? I mean, Michigan because you guys you work here. That's where you play and work. But in other parts, what are you looking for? What are the markers that say these guys get it?
Yeah, so if you think about it, if you look at the elements of a region, one is access to technology, and that's something we've always been quite strong in, and I think our universities do a better job than ever in taking technology developed there and spinning it out into startups. Next element's going to be people, technology people, and then I would say company management people. Technology people, we certainly put out a lot of graduates in the technology area. We've had some challenges sometimes in keeping them. The bigger challenge has been leadership, the C-level talent, because we don't have a long history of C-level talent in the startup community. So some of that is importing people who have Michigan backgrounds. Some of that is an example like Duo Security that you mentioned. That second level of management that was in Duo, they're now CEOs of new companies. That's an example. Another would be culture. That has probably been our biggest issue as a region is we have a culture of being a safe, big company region. It's changed pretty dramatically over the last 15 years, but it is still an issue that we face.
Didn't you tell us a story backstage about the engineer you interviewed, what was it, 15 or 20 years ago?
Sure. So this was right around the time of the Great Recession, and we were had a really interesting startup company, and we were trying to recruit a high-end engineer who was interestingly coming out of one of the big three. And we're talking about stock options, we're talking about technology development. He's talking about what's my 401k like, what's vacation like. And it was a sign of the cultural differences. Those were questions you weren't hearing on the coast But because of the culture here, those were questions that we were getting here. Now, I will say that's changed quite a bit. The Great Recession was bad in a lot of ways. One silver lining of it was there was a perception, big company safe, startup company risky. And that got turned on its head. Everything has a level of risk. And after that, we saw more talented people who were willing to take the perceived risk of a startup, realizing that the difference in risk wasn't as great as they thought. That was a turning point for the state. We still have some of that, but it has gotten considerably better since then.
Is it generational? Do people coming out of college and graduate school now, at 25, 28, 27 years old, are they more open to that kind of culture?
Yes. First of all, they're not coming out thinking they're going to work for one or two companies in their career. And yes, they're more open to risk, and they understand the upside from a life standpoint, from an interest in daily work standpoint, but also there's a monetary upside that they just don't get in large companies.
Do you think? Go ahead.
Daniel, what I would add is sometimes a number of our leadership teams for the companies we've invested in, they're actually more seasoned engineers. They've been, first-time founders, second-time founders. So not always, but I think the pattern still holds. To the point of culture, I played team sports, love sports. I had a coach that said, practice makes not perfect, but permanent. Or excuse me, not perfect, but permanent. And what I mean by that is culturally, when you do something over and over and over again, it reinforces body-mind what you're out in the world to do. And when you live in the world that we do, we talk about fail fast, okay, whatever, but it means that you have to stand up and dust yourself off again. And I think that's where people have started locally to make that mindset shift of what am I really trading in terms of time value. For the younger folks, there's no denying coming out of four-year school or even grad school, the cost of that education is a burden for many of them to actually take that entrepreneurial journey. So that's why I say not exclusively, but we are seeing more people have those reps to say, I'll try, I'll fail, I'll do it again.
Rishi, you're going to say something?
Similar to that, so just not buying into the the Hollywood version of the entrepreneur is 19 years old, right, in a garage. Like, we have some of the best concentration of engineering talent in the country, and these are folks at some of your companies or have been here through our research universities that want to found things, that want to build here, that want to stay here and succeed, and they have the expertise. And sometimes we think it's a zero-sum game. Well, if we invest in our founders and we put capital as entrepreneurs, existing institutions might not benefit, but that's also a myth because a lot of the good talent transfer back and forth comes from ecosystems that have both healthy entrepreneurial capital going into them as well as strong institutional, corporate industry partners.
Ben, what are the geographic players here, the competition, number one? And number two, has that set of competitors grown geographically?
Outside of the state of Michigan, that is?
Outside of the state.
Yeah. So we like to talk a lot about Ohio and Michigan or others in the Midwest. I'm always going around saying, I sure hope we can do a lot better than just Ohio. They are still kicking our butts, and we're really far behind. Last week, the governor signed the Michigan Innovation Fund and the R&D tax credit. Amazing milestones, but the last time that the state has put that much into the innovation ecosystem, at least on the entrepreneurship innovation side of the thing, I was in middle school. I'm 34 now, but I was in middle school when the state put that much in the last time. And so I'm hoping that that is step one in a longer, more sustained journey of putting some funding in, because we are behind compared to some of our peer states. And so, yes, Ohio is certainly one that we regularly look to, and we've got to think a lot bigger and be a little bit spicier in terms of some of the how big we're willing to go to be able to play catch up. Because we can do small incremental changes here and there, but it'll be really easy for those that are ahead of us to continue staying in the lead unless we make some really big bets.
I've been doing this in the state for a long time, and one truism, I think, is that when it comes to economic development, it is a pendulum. And it really just depends on number one, who's in office, what party they're from, and essentially what the person before me did, I'm going to chuck it. And if you go back and you look at the last 4 or 5 governors, I think that you'll find that that happened every time. That there were very few things that were embraced. There was not this coalescence around a strategy. How do we beat Ohio, as an example? How are we the best in the Midwest? How do we leverage the University of Michigan and what it offers, and other universities? There's talk about it, but it's not something I think that is universal. Which
yeah, I'd love to jump in and say, I mean, that's one of our challenges as an innovation entrepreneurial community. If you think of some of the key things we've been talking about all day today, right? Retaining talent, growing jobs, being inclusive so all folks can participate in our economy. The work we're doing squarely hits those points as key drivers in Michigan. And so, right, we're focused on high achievers who are creating, by definition, something that didn't exist and that's growing, which is creating net new jobs, right? It's keeping that talent here. It's creating a flywheel effect when they bring in capital and they can exit from that company and therefore mint a lot of other people with capital who have that mindset that I can launch a company here in Michigan. So when we talk about cultural shifts, we need to think about tying these things, talent and capital, together so that we can keep Michigan competitive over the next several years.
I'll note, too, that what's a little bit different now, you're absolutely right that one of the downsides of being a purple state is that pendulum swing, where just as something gets going, gets pulled away. I think the reason that Santa Ono earlier today pointed out that this is our year, and then Josh from Michigan Central a bit later said we have a moment, is we've got an alignment of multiple stakeholders within government, the 3 R1 university presidents, you have the business community. The fact that this conference is focused on the innovation economy, I think that's something that is a very positive indicator as well. And so when you have the big stakeholders in an innovation ecosystem all saying the same thing, that we need to think bigger, we need to think differently, we need to figure out how we nurture this culture of innovation and are a little bit more competitive with the state actually involved in the strategy and sort of leading the big vision. I think that's what's different now, in addition to the usual pendulum swing that certainly will happen within state government. So I totally agree with Santa and Josh that we have a relatively small window in time to get this right before some of those pieces of that puzzle may start to get away from us a little bit quicker.
Will the culture that we described here, will that allow it? Will that enable it? Will that nurture what you're talking about?
I'm super optimistic in the 8 months that I've been in this role, a role created specifically to be looking at this. I've never been more optimistic about Michigan's future because I think that we are at a turning point to be able to have that culture. It is there in pockets, but we're turning a really big ship with a lot of heritage, but all of the signs that I've seen so far are pointing.
Well, and you certainly have big auto companies that talk a good game about being able to play like that. Now, whether they're actually able to do that, I think still very much remains to be seen.
Sure.
And they've backed away from some things. Chris, I wanted to ask you, how do you get the prospects, these potential businesses, before investors? Because they may not be able to find them otherwise. I think you have a program that you've worked on.
Yeah, so at Renaissance, we're a fund of funds. So we invest in venture capital funds around the country under the condition that they are willing to look at Michigan startups. And 10 years ago, we started something we call Undemo Day. Sort of the opposite. Everybody has demo days where it's sort of dog and pony shows. And our idea was to create a day where Michigan startups could get meaningful meetings with venture capitalists from around the country. The first one we did in a little office in Ann Arbor. We had 12 startups and about 15 venture funds. Fast forward, it's now twice a year. We take over Ford Field in the fall, and last fall in October, we had 240 Michigan startups and about 250 VCs from around the country, many of whom had never stepped foot in Michigan before. Ben talked about how the successes in Michigan are becoming more well known. Michigan is now a place where folks who wouldn't previously look are willing to look. So you fast forward through this, and we've now helped attract about $3 billion to Michigan startups through this network we've created. It gets easier each year to get funds from other parts of the country to look at startups here because of all the reasons I talked about earlier. Great technology, great engineering, and improving climate. So Undemo Day has been a big enough success that we've been contacted by almost every region of the country wanting to replicate what we're doing here in their region.
Jessica, I'm curious about electrification in the auto industry and whether you think there's evidence that that has changed the consideration of Michigan as a place to invest, that these companies have demonstrated a technical capability that a lot of people didn't think they had. You know, the biggest battle, I think, for the Detroit is Silicon Valley. It's not the Japanese or the South Koreans. But I'm wondering if you see that has made an impact.
Yeah, the question about the pendulum swinging, it actually reminds me of corporate innovation and investment, unfortunately, as well. And, you know, EVs have become politicized, but they don't need to be a political issue because that supply chain is critical to our industrial capability in so many other areas, including grid resiliency, which is important to navigate the climate challenges that we have ahead. So what we see is, of course, a multi-powertrain future moving forward. At the same time, we have a new generation of engineers in Michigan, but also other places that know how to do things like mechatronics, right? You have mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, software, AI all together. And even if these larger companies aren't going to move forward with programs at the same speed that they may have previously thought, those engineers are still going to do what they do well. They may just not do that anymore. So they're moving into robotics, they're moving into drones, they're moving into, again, grid storage, battery, other areas. And, you know, at the end of the day, that's what I do. I bet on companies that see opportunities that the large incumbents can't go after or won't go after. So I want our largest employers in Michigan to succeed. I truly do. At the same time, am I placing bets on others that are out to eat their lunch in some cases? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. We have less than a minute, so I want to go around and I want to ask each of you, what is the strongest piece of Michigan's culture in this investment space, and what's the biggest barrier or weakest point?
I think the strongest piece that exists now that didn't exist before and why I'm optimistic is this mindset on 1 + 1 = 3.
Negative?
Biggest thing that holds us back, thinking too small.
Rishi?
I would say our biggest strength is our founders, our entrepreneurs, our people. We don't need to be like the coast or even any of the states around us, but let's just take bets on the founders right now that are saying, we're ready to go, we want to build. Let's get them some capital. If you can't get capital, we need customers for our founders, and that's something you can do, and that's a real positive. And so the negative would be if you don't take a step forward and invest in our founders, either with dollars or as a customer or amplifying our story that we're an entrepreneurial state.
I think the biggest positive is we have so much interesting technology and innovation going on here that we haven't captured in the past. I would say the biggest challenge for us is getting everybody at the table.
I think that's true.
Yeah, negative first. We have capital still sitting on the sidelines that's not being activated as it should. People would be what I would have said if everyone already said that as a strength. So I would say we are truly on the world stage, whether it's the infrastructure investments we made, our universities, our sports teams. People around the world are rooting for Detroit, and that momentum is ours to run with.
It's a good note to end it on. Thank you very much.
Ever wonder what everyone's doing on their phones? They're banking with Bank of America. They're saving, planning, and budgeting all before dessert.
Digital tools so impressive, you just can't stop banking. What would you like the power to do?